This is Paul Schmid. Welcome to the Pursuit Zone. After a job layoff, my next guest avoided the temptation to rush back to work and used the opportunity to thru-hike the Appalachian Trail south to north over 24 weeks from May to October of 2012. He managed to survive encounters with ticks, mice, snakes, feral ponies, and a storm that could have killed him. Aaron Hushagen, or Hoosh as he was known on the trail, welcome to the Pursuit Zone.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Aaron, have you ever done any long-distance hikes before this?
Before this, the longest I had hiked was about a week or so, and I'd done that on a few different occasions. I hiked the Superior Hiking Trail right after high school graduation for 5 days or so, and right before college began, I hiked down near Escalante, Utah in the canyons. And then I did a couple hikes when I was living in Alaska. I spent a summer in Alaska, and I did a couple hikes up there that were about a week or so each, one of them across Kodiak Island.
What got you interested in the outdoors?
I grew up in the outdoors. I'm from a small rural town an hour and a half north of Minneapolis, and I have 3 younger brothers. And all 4 of us are within 5 years of age, so we were very close. And we grew up out in the country, so we were always outside playing around. And my dad got us into hunting and fishing at an early age, and camping, canoeing, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of been in my blood all along.
Why the Appalachian Trail?
It was something I'd heard about many years ago that piqued my interest. There are a number of things that have done that over the years, but it was something that I kind of had in the background or in the back of my mind as something I would want to do at some point, kind of on my bucket list, I guess you could say. The problem was I never had the opportunity to do it because it requires a large amount of time. And most employers aren't willing to let you take off for half a year and still hold your job for you.
How hard was it to resist that urge to jump right back into work?
Well, it was difficult because you kind of get programmed to do that. So I was laid off in February, and instantly I started thinking about, okay, I have to start job searching, start that whole process, which is a job itself. And I thought, well, maybe this would be a good opportunity to do one of these things that I've been wanting to do that's going to take a lot of time where you can't work at the same time. So this obviously came up, and I had to kind of fight with myself a little bit and convince myself to give it an honest thought. So I figured this would probably be my best opportunity to do something like this, since I already had this break. I didn't have to quit a job. I didn't have to ask for time off. I already had the time off. So it just seemed like an opportunity.
Describe the route for me. Where did you start? How do you get there?
Started down in Georgia at Amicalola Falls State Park, and a friend of mine actually offered to drive me down there. When I told him about my idea to do this hike, he was pretty interested. He had never done any long distance hiking himself, and he wasn't able to try a through hike, but he wanted to ride down there or drive me down there and hike with me for the first week or so. So we drove down in 2 days and started the hike together. And he hiked with me for about 6 days or so. And then he went back home, and I continued the rest on my own.
Are there any highlights of the route that you can describe, and what are their challenges?
For me, I was really interested in just the being in the mountains, because here in Minnesota, we've got a lot of different things, but we don't have any legitimate mountains. So my favorite parts, and this is a popular question, obviously, is, what was your favorite part of the hike? And there were so many things I was fond of, but I would say the beginning section of the hike through Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee, and then the final section through like Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, because they were more mountainous. You had greater elevation changes and excellent viewpoints.
Tell me about some of the interesting people that you met on the trail.
Well, I met a lot of people on the trail. A lot of folks back home think that you're kind of out there by yourself in the wilderness, and that's just really not the case. It's the most popular hiking trail in the world, so I ran across hikers almost every single day, whether they were day hikers or weekenders. Maybe they were section hikers hiking the whole trail but in different sections throughout different years, or there were plenty of other through hikers as well. So every day I was coming across people, and I met plenty of interesting people. Some of them had similar interests. Well, a lot of us had similar interests being out there and trying this through hike. But people who were hiking a similar pace to me, who I got along with, I would actually meet up and hike with them for maybe a day or two, up to a week or two. I think it was about 2 to 3 weeks was the longest that I ever hiked with any one particular person. But as far as the different hikers goes, there were recent college grads all the way up to folks that had recently retired. And oddly enough, it seemed like those were the majority of the people out there. I kind of felt like I was a rarity being in my mid-30s being out there, because most people either had just come out of college or they had just finished working. So the working class didn't seem to be out there for obvious reasons, because like I said before, it's hard to get that kind of time off.
Tell me about this guy, Big Daddy.
Big Daddy, he was one of the first guys that I met, so that was within the first week of hiking, and he was just a section hiker, so he wasn't trying to do a through hike. We kind of leapfrogged each other for a little while, and he was telling me about snakes, and I'm only familiar with snakes from Minnesota, and we don't really have to deal with poisonous snakes for the most part up here. And he was telling me about copperheads, and he warned me to watch out when I go to the water source to collect water, because he had been finding copperheads at the water sources, and he said that he had been killing them, which I don't agree with, even if they were copperheads. But lo and behold, I find out later that actually what he was killing were harmless garter snakes.
Now, did you have an opportunity when you got back to research snakes in the Appalachian Trail, and are snakes really a hazard throughout the trail?
Yeah, they can be, but like most any animal, they're more afraid of you than you are of them. And if you just leave them alone and don't provoke them, there's not going to be a problem. But there are copperheads out there, there are rattlesnakes out there, and I did see some of each of those. I didn't have any problems with them myself, but I did hear one account of there was a particular shelter where a rattlesnake was hanging out, and people had been writing in the shelter logbook about it. And I heard, after I had already been through that area, I heard a story of a guy that ended up getting bit by it later on. So that was the one and only story that I heard of anybody having an actual problem with snakes out there.
Take me through a typical day for you when you're on the trail.
A typical day would be, I started out making some sort of breakfast when I would wake up in the morning, and I scrapped that idea because it just took too long. It chewed up too much hiking time, because you had to get everything out and set it up and cook it and eat it, clean, put it all away, and then you're already kind of behind for your day. So after that, I would just put like a power bar or a Cliff Bar in my pocket, or some Gorp, good old raisins and peanuts, and just start hiking. And I would just munch on that stuff along the way. But after waking up, it's basically get your stuff together and hit the trail, and you're walking pretty much all day. So it gets pretty monotonous, but you take your breaks along the way to rest or to eat. You take a lunch break, or if you if you pass a great overlook, or you're next to a river, you can take a dip in the river, but essentially you're walking all day until it's getting close to dark, and you look for a shelter or a spot to cowboy camp, or if you have a tent or a hammock, to put that up. And at that point, it's focus on getting food, getting dinner going. By the time you're done eating and cleaning up and putting away all of your stuff from dinner, you're pretty tired. So it's most people's next thought is crawl into bed and get some sleep to get up and do it all over again. And one of the things that a lot of people start off doing is bringing along books or e-readers, to thinking that they're going to do a lot of reading at night. But the funny thing is, you're so exhausted by the time you're done with dinner that you usually would rather just go to sleep than read.
So how do you keep up your motivation? How do you prevent boredom?
Well, the social aspect of the trail certainly helps with that. Meeting other people, hiking with other people along the way. I guess you have to kind of just have a strong will in the first place, because, like I said, it gets pretty monotonous, and it's obviously challenging. So for me, like I said, I grew up in the outdoors. I love being in the outdoors. It was much better than being in the office, so I wanted to prolong that as much as I could. And you always have a goal in sight. Obviously, Mount Katahdin, the finish of the entire trail, is the ultimate goal, but you have to break that down into much smaller goals and just focus on getting to the next state line or the next, whatever the milestone may be. That way it's a little more manageable, because focusing on a goal that's still 2,000 miles away is kind of tough to do, tough to handle mentally.
When I saw your presentation, you talked a lot about wild mushrooms. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I saw all kinds of wild mushrooms, and took a lot of photos of them. And the thing is, I only know about one of them that's edible. So the one that I'm familiar with is called the sulfur shelf. And my dad taught me and my brothers about that when we were young, and we would collect them around the property in Minnesota and eat them. And I found the same mushrooms on the trail here and there, actually a fair amount of times. And so I would do the same thing. I would collect those. I would bag them up, throw them in my pack, and bring them to wherever I was going to camp that evening. And I would cook them for a little change of pace, because the food that hikers are packing with them, it gets pretty old pretty fast, because a lot of it is the same stuff over and over. It's a lot of dehydrated food, just add water to rice or to noodles and so on and so forth. So it was a nice change of pace to have fresh mushrooms to go with that.
Is this the mushroom that's also known as chicken of the woods or chicken of the forest?
No, I'm familiar with that one as well. I don't know it well enough to pick it out and say with confidence we can eat this, but there's another one that is called, I think, hen of the woods. I've also heard, but when you Google it, there's a lot of confusion out there too. I know some people call them the same thing. They'll say that the sulfur shelf mushroom is that one you spoke of, but I believe that's actually a different mushroom, another edible mushroom.
Tell me about trail angels and trail magic.
Trail angels are they're strangers helping out strangers, essentially. It's people along the trail that are aware of what thru-hikers are going through, trying to accomplish this feat, and they are helping them out by, it could be something as simple as driving to where the trail intersects a road, hiking down the trail 100 yards, and hanging a bag in a tree that's full of junk food or snack food or soda or something that is not on the normal menu for the day-to-day menu for a thru-hiker. So basically like a treat. Sometimes they would make brownies or something to that effect and leave them out. Or it could be as simple as some bottles of water, especially in the middle of the summer when we had triple-digit heat and water sources were scarce. Or a trail angel could be somebody who simply gives you a ride into town if you need to go into the nearest town to resupply, or perhaps they invite you over to their house and allow you to do your laundry and shower. They might feed you and let you sleep there. So trail angels are they're just nice folks who are out there helping out thru hikers. And the stuff that they are leaving along the trail, the coolers full of drinks and food, that would be considered the trail magic.
Tell me more about these logbooks.
The logbooks, there's a few different books that you can get to help you along the trail, and one of them is called the data book. And this one, it doesn't have any. It has just data, as the name suggests. It doesn't have any maps or anything else, but it does tell you whether you're going south to north or the opposite. It will tell you the mileages from this point to that point. So the points could be from a shelter to the next water source, or from that water source to the next road, or to the next town, and how far off the trail that town happens to be, and so on and so forth. And then there are a few other books. Another one's called the Thru-Hiker's Companion, which has a lot of that same info, but in addition, it will have little maps of the towns showing you where the grocery store is and the post office is, and they have descriptions of things along the way, some of the history and whatnot. And there's yet another one, the Thru-Hiker's Guide, that has all of that, plus it has elevation pages in it, so you can see what's coming as far as big climbs or steep descents.
How did you run into those feral ponies?
They're in one particular area on the hike, and it's in those books I was just speaking of. They tell you about it, and they're kind of just hang out in that area. And as you come down the trail, they're just wild ponies out there, which we're not used to seeing. We're used to seeing them, behind fences on somebody's farm, but they're very accustomed to humans. They're pretty much expecting to see people coming down the trail, I found out, because when I first saw them, it was pretty neat, and I was happy to be up close and personal with them, but they quickly became overbearing and almost more nuisance-like, because there were a lot of them, and they all ran in very close, and I had some snacks in my pocket, and they could smell that, and they were trying to eat the food through my pocket. And once one saw the other one going for that, he wanted to get in too. And so pretty quickly it became uncomfortable. So I had to just kind of push them out of my way to get back on the trail. But I first took a lot of photos, because they were pretty adorable. It's just that in the photos you can't see how annoying or how they can be a nuisance.
Tell me a little more about the storm that potentially could have killed you.
Okay, there was a storm that they called a derecho. I was not familiar with that term, and I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but it's a combination of multiple different storms. So there were 3 or 4 storms that had been blowing from west to east. I think one of them even caused some damage or some ruckus up in like the Chicago area. And as they moved farther east, they kind of converged into one big storm. And this was around 4th of July time. And I believe it made national news at the time, because it did a lot of damage out east, like in D.C., for example, experienced a lot of damage from the storm. And it had rain as well as straight line winds, which were more the problem. And I was hiking along with another guy, and it was toward the end of the day, so it was just about to start to lose light, and it just felt like it was going to rain. So I was near this big rock outcropping where you could see quite a distance, and I ran out there just to take a look, because up in the mountains you can see the rain coming. And as I looked around, I had, maybe a 270-degree view. I didn't see any actual rain. So I went back onto the trail, and within 5 minutes from the one angle that I couldn't see, the storm came up over the ridge, and the sky turned kind of greenish, and the winds started whipping, and branches started breaking, and then the tree trunks themselves started breaking, and trees were coming down all over the place. So it's already difficult to see, and now you've got bark and pieces of wood flying through the air, stinging you in the eyes, so it's even more difficult to see. And these huge trees are crashing down, and I didn't know if the guy I was hiking with was ahead of me or behind me at this point, since I had ducked off to look for rain. So I ran up to one of the bigger trees thinking I could use it as protection. And as I looked up, I saw that one had already been snapped off. So it didn't seem like there really was any safe place to go. We were kind of up on this ridge, and our goal was to get to a shelter at the bottom of that ridge. So I started running, and I ran across the other hiker who had just narrowly avoided getting squashed by a tree. He had his headlamp on already before the storm hit. And this tree fell down so close to him that it ripped the headlamp right off of his forehead. And he had another side satchel around his shoulder, and it tore that off too. So he literally came within an inch of dying in that storm. So we basically just started sprinting down the trail, hurdling fallen trees, these recently fallen trees. Meanwhile, they were still falling ahead of us, behind us. There literally was no safe place. So all we wanted to do was to try to get down off the ridge. And so we both made it. And the next day, it was a nice day. We went back up to kind of look at the damage, and it was unreal. You couldn't even, in a lot of areas, you couldn't even tell where the trail was anymore. It just, everything had green foliage. All the trees that had fallen, their leaves are poking out, and it just looked like everything was woods and that there wasn't any trail. So you had to kind of crawl through like it was a jungle gym. So that's actually the closest I came to any kind of near-death experiences on my hike.
Well, that had to be thrilling, but scary.
Yes, yeah, very. It was a lot of adrenaline, and it makes for a good story now, but at the time it was pretty freaky.
So beyond the storm, which potentially could have caused some injury, how did you hold up physically?
I did fairly well, except I would say my feet were the worst part. And actually, it was like the second day of the hike, I started to get some pain in one of the joints in my foot, and it just progressed from there. It got worse and worse. And in the middle of the hike, around Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, it was super painful every step that I took. And this was honestly the closest that I came to thinking I might have to quit the hike, because I wasn't going to let anything get in the way unless obviously some type of injury happened or I was going to cause irreversible damage. And at that point, that's what I was concerned with. Was I causing irreversible damage to my feet? All the way across the bottoms of my feet were painful. It started up with my toes. I had issues with my Achilles. It felt like I had issues with plantar fasciitis. And so when I was in Harper's Ferry, I looked up some information for this woman who was a chiropractor and massage therapist. And I visited with her and had her assess my my condition. And I told her that I understand it's going to hurt. I'm walking a lot every day, but I want to make sure I'm not causing damage to where after this hike I can't play sports anymore or I can't run anymore. So she took a look, and she didn't see anything that looked like it was going to be that kind of damage. So at that point, it was just a matter of learning to manage the pain more so. I still didn't feel like quitting. I certainly did not want to quit. So what I did was I kind of kept Advil in business. I took a lot of Advil. I took a leave every day. And I also stopped at every water source I came across. At that point, it was streams, creeks, springs for the most part. and I would take off my shoes and soak my feet. And in some of them, especially the springs, the water was very cold, so it would numb my feet. It was so cold I couldn't even keep my feet in for very long. So I would basically numb my feet, and it would refresh them, and then I'd throw my shoes back on and keep hiking. So I was doing that for a while, and eventually, I don't know, my feet just got more accustomed to it. And I also went through different pairs of shoes, so that could have something to do with it. But eventually, the pain started to diminish. There was always some sort of numbness in my toes or some sort of pain somewhere along the way, but not so bad where I was having thoughts that I would have to quit.
Have you had a chance to talk with other thru hikers? Is this a common malady among thru hikers?
Yeah, I was talking to a lot of people at the time because I was pretty concerned, and I found out that like the numbness it was my big toes the tips of my big toes had pretty much gone numb. They were numb all the time, and I found out that was not uncommon, and that in fact even after you've finished hiking, so I had heard that it remains for a few months, which it did. So it was kind of comforting to hear that other people were experiencing the same thing, and that they had heard stories of previous thru hikers who had gone through that and turned out fine after their hike.
How many pairs of shoes did you go through?
I went through 3, which I think the average, they say, is around 4 or so. But I started off with a pair of running shoes that I'd already owned for a couple of years that I ran races in, and surprisingly, those lasted about 800 to 900 miles before they literally started falling apart. And then I went to a trail runner after that, so an even lighter weight shoe, and the timing of moving to a lighter weight shoe was probably not so good because I had those trail runners on as I went through Pennsylvania, which is known as a very rocky state. It's known to chew up footwear, and it did just that. The trail runners did not last long at all, and I could feel the rocks a lot more through them. And in Pennsylvania, there are oftentimes stretches where you're constantly stepping on the tops of rocks. There's not really like a dirt path for you to walk on. You have to walk across rocks. So that got annoying pretty quickly. And at the end of Pennsylvania, I ended up switching to my 3rd pair of shoes, which was a mid-high pair of Merrell Moab ventilators that have the Vibram sole. And those were my favorite of the 3 pair of shoes that I used because the sole was a little more rigid. So when I would step on a rock, I couldn't feel every point or curve of that rock in the bottom of my feet. It also gave a little more ankle support, but they were also heavier than the previous 2 pair of shoes.
If you had to do it over again, which pair would you start with?
I'd probably go straight to the Merrells, the mid-high hiking shoe, mostly just because if the running shoe and the trail runner had anything to do with my feet feeling as bad as they did back then, I would want to definitely skip that. So I would probably start with that pair of Merrells and see if my feet still go through the same sort of pain or not.
So when you reached the end, what did that feel like?
It was mixed emotions. For 5.5 months, I had this ultimate goal in mind. I was always trudging forward, trying to get to Katahdin, and it just became. It was just ever present. It was always there, and it was always so far away. And so when I got there, it was obviously a very joyous feeling, a feeling of accomplishment. At the same time, it felt a little depressing and a little weird that it was all of a sudden over after such a long time aiming for that goal and every day getting up and walking. So to finally be there, then you also had to consider the fact that, okay, now my hike, my outdoors experience, my this fun thing that I've been doing is coming to an end, and now it's time to try to get back into the real world. So it was there were mixed emotions. It was kind of a weird feeling.
I'm curious if the experience hiking the trail helped you get back into the real world, the real job.
I wouldn't say that it helped me with that. Actually, when I finished the trail, I didn't really feel like going back into a corporate role. Like I mentioned previously, I'd grown up in the outdoors, and I've been doing that for as long as I can remember, and I love being outdoors, so being cooped up in an office, sitting in a cube, staring at a computer is not exactly ideal. So after being outside doing things that I love, granted, it wasn't all fun. There were bad days and there were tough days. It still was more up my alley and more what I wanted to be doing. So the thought of having to go back and sit in rush hour traffic and go to the office, that was tough to swallow.
I recently went through a layoff myself, and I can tell you that the one question every employer asked me was, how long have you been out of work? So that's why I was curious if your trip became a help or a hindrance.
Yeah, that's definitely something. That was something that I considered up front before I even decided to go on the hike, because people don't want to have the gaps in their resume. You don't want to have to necessarily explain why you didn't work for that 6 months or the 9 or the year or whatever it ends up being. But I could tell myself I need to get back to work, and I will hike the trail later. And I can tell myself that year after year, I have to work now, I'll hike the trail later. And later on, I might not be able to hike the trail. If I put it off until retirement, who knows? I could have an injury in one of the many sports that I play, or I could lose the passion for it or the will to do it. So to me, it was something where I was willing to take the risk of having the gap in my resume in order to do this, I guess you could say, lifelong dream.
Let's talk about preparing for the trip. How long did it take you to plan for it?
It took me a little while to make my decision because, like I was mentioning, it was tough it wasn't easy to just say, yeah, I'm going to go do the hike. So I debated it for a while, and by the time I finally made my decision, it was really go time. Most people plan a lot earlier, a lot more in advance than I had. So there were already people that were on the trail. The early hikers had already started, and here I was, and I hadn't even really started doing any research. So I spent about a month to a month and a half mostly researching, and a lot of it was focused on gear. I have a lot of the gear that's necessary, and I thought I didn't need to really purchase a lot of new stuff. But when I started throwing my items on the scale, I realized that I needed to purchase new ultralight gear because my internal frame pack alone, empty, weighed 7 pounds. And I was trying to get my total gear, not food and water, but just the gear, down to around 10 pounds, including the weight of the backpack. So I had to spend a lot of time researching all the different gear, trying to figure out what to buy, what I would actually need versus what just looked cool, and try to do it somewhat affordable as well, since I no longer had a job. So I spent a lot of time looking into that stuff, and then when it was time to pull the trigger, I just kind of went down the list and started ordering things, and it all kind of showed up at once, and I didn't even really have a lot of time left to do any kind of test hike. I did get out with my friend who drove me down there, and we did one overnight. I needed to at least get out and spend one night out in the woods with this gear and make sure everything worked the way that I had read, the way that I was expecting. So most of my planning was just looking into the literature that I would need and trying to gather information on the trail and find out what people had done in the past, and then the gear. I didn't spend any time training, doing anything physical for it. I play a lot of sports year round, so I was already in fairly decent shape. I wasn't too worried about that piece. It was just my bigger fears were wood ticks and Lyme disease, or like what had happened with my feet with the repetitive use of walking each and every day. What's that going to do to me? So not a lot of physical preparation, just a lot of research crammed into 4 to 6 weeks or so, and then it was go time. And I was already considered a late starter because I started in May. I started on May 4th, and most people are starting in March or April when they're doing a northbound through hike.
How much did the trip end up costing you?
I think all in all, I spent around $8,000 or $9,000, which is high for what you'll see out there. I think depending on which website you're looking at, they say expect to spend anywhere from $3,000 to $6,000. But I also took some time off along the way. And my girlfriend came down, for example, 3 different times to meet up with me. And I took anywhere from 5 to 7 days off of the trail to go around and see some cities out on the East Coast that we had never been to. So I'd spent extra money doing that. I also didn't really hold back when I came into town. If there was something that I wanted to eat or do, I would do it. For example, I was surprised I found sushi at a number of the towns, at least in the first half of the hike. So anytime I found that there was sushi available, I would run out and splurge on that. I also went to see movies. I saw at least half a dozen movies. Just anything to break up the monotony I was speaking of walking every day. So when you get into town, you just kind of want to release and pig out and eat whatever you want. And so being that I'd already been employed and working in corporate America for 14 years or so and had a decent savings built up, I was able to just kind of get what I wanted. Whereas there were some other hikers out there, the recent college grads, for example, that were pinching pennies and trying to scrape by for obvious reasons. So they weren't able to do all the same stuff that I was. So I definitely spent more than the average through hiker.
What would be your advice for someone that's going to through hike the trail?
I would say definitely do your research. Try to keep the weight low, because I came across many different people who had way too much stuff that they didn't need. And I think that caused a lot of problems. They say I've read anywhere from 1 out of 5 to only 1 out of 8 actually succeeds in completing their through hike. And a lot of those people drop off in the very beginning of the hike. So do the necessary research for your gear, do the necessary research about learning about previous through hikers. In this day and age, there are all kinds of blogs and other pages out there that you can read exactly how it went for somebody else, and you can base your preparation off of that. But mostly you have to know, you have to have the willpower to do it. You have to know that it is something that you definitely want to do, and it's more of a challenge mentally than it is physically. And it's definitely a big physical challenge, but I think the tougher part by far is the mental challenge. So sticking to your guns and pacing yourself. For example, in the beginning of your hike, I wouldn't suggest running off trying to do 20 miles a day. I started off around 12 miles a day, and my goal was to get up to an average of around 20 miles, ideally, per day. But there were a lot of people who went out too hard, too fast in the beginning, and they paid the price for it. Do your research and make sure that it's definitely something that you want to do, and then put your mind to it.
What's the biggest lesson that you learned from the trip? Is there a takeaway?
Is probably, one of the things that really surprised me about the trip was it, in a way, restored my faith in humanity, you could almost say. And that's in big part, it's due to the trail angels, the strangers out there that were willing to go out of their way and spend their hard-earned dollars on a complete stranger, a grubby, dirty, smelly, hairy thru-hiker that just comes straggling through town. And there are people out there that are nice, and they'll give you that ride that you need, or they'll let you do your laundry at their place, or they'll feed you, or whatnot. That was something that really opened my eyes, because I don't see a lot of that these days, at least where I live now. And it's a little different out there around the trail. It's the trail town mentality. They expect it every season. They know that the hikers are coming through, but still, it was quite a nice surprise, and it was definitely a huge help.
What's next for you, Aaron?
Well, right now it's just back to the grind. It's work for me, unfortunately, now. But as far as trips go, another very popular question is, would I do it again? And my answer to that is yes. I wouldn't necessarily do the Appalachian Trail. I would probably look at the Pacific Crest or the Continental Divide Trail if I were to do this again. But if I were able to pull it off by getting the time off, I think that it was something that I would definitely do again.
How can someone contact you if they want to learn more about your thru-hike?
They can contact me at my email address, which is a Gmail address. It's HOOSCHE at Gmail. It's basically Hoosh at Gmail with a silent E.
Aaron Hushagen, thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. Congratulations on your accomplishment. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Recorded May 15, 2013. Listen to more great podcasts at thepursuitzone.com.